You are now.
Just keep it for today.
Well, I'm translating, so who can translate?
All right, friends, we're back, I think.
Estamos de regreso.
And again, we long for the days of the old ways, seem to be a lot easier.
Anhelamos los tiempos antiguos.
But we're going to work with what we got. So welcome back. Thank you again for your maaser to Yahuwah. I want you to know that you're a true bracha to this end time prophetic work. Today we will continue with part 2 of the message entitled The Ezra Monopoly and the XIV. The Ezra Monopoly and the XIV. On the screen, you'll see the scripture 2 Kings 17, verses 27 to 28. Second Kings 17, verses 27 through 28. In approximately 623 BC, a revival broke out in Jerusalem under Melech Yoshiyahu. Turn with me, please, to 2 Kings 17. And we're going to pick it up in verse 22 and forward. Second Kings 17, verses 27 and 28. Second Kings 17, 28.
Segunda de
Then the Melech of Ashur, verse 27, commanded, saying, let me read the whole thing. Carry there one of the Kohanim whom you brought from there, and let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the manner of the Elohim of the land. I think I'm going to keep things less complicated. I'm going to use the text. So in 2 Kings 17, verse 28, we see the king of Assyria saying, take the Kohanim who were carried away to Shomron and let him go to Jerusalem to learn and receive the Torah, and let him go and to go back to Samaria and dwell there to teach the residents of Samaria the manner of the Elohim of the land. This is very important to understand. Verse 28 says this, then one of the Kohanim whom they had carried away from Shomron went to dwell in Bethel to teach them how the people of the land, meaning the area of the north, should serve Elohim and fear Elohim. So when the revival had broken out in Yehuda under Melech Yoshiyahu, the king of Ashur said, let one of the Kohanim who you took from Shomron go there and then return to Bethel in Shomron to teach them the ways of Elohim. Let me try that again. Was muted. The Shomronim received a copy of the Paleo-Hebrew Torah.
Los samaritanos recibieron una copia de la escritura samaritana.
Exactly at this point in Scripture. Just read that the king of Assyria said, let one of the Kohanim of the exile go from Samaria to Jerusalem to learn and then come back to Shomron to teach the Shomronites the ways of the Elohim of the land. When this Kohen was sent from the king of Shomron, he returned to Shomron with a Paleo copy of the Torah. Melech Yoshiyahu was a righteous king, and surely after he found the Torah, and we're going to read that in a minute, he would share the Torah and proclaim the Torah willingly with anyone who wanted to follow Yahuwah.
Con quien estuviera interesado.
Now go with me, please, to chapter 22, 2 Kings 22, verses 8 through 13. 2 Kings 22, verses 8 through 13. And pay attention because we need to stay focused, please. And Hilkiyahu the Kohen Hagadol said to Shaphan the Sofer, I have found in the scroll of the Torah, this is the Kohen Hagadol talking, in the Bayit of Yahuwah, a Torah. And Hilkiyahu, the Kohen Hagadol, gave the scroll to Shaphan the Sofer, and the scribe read it. You're muting, right? When I'm talking. Verse 9.
Verso 9.
And Shaphan the Sofer came to the Melech and brought the Melech word again and said, your avadim have gathered the silver that was found in the Bayit and have delivered it to the hand of those who do the work and that have the oversight of the Bayit of Yahuwah.
Viniendo luego
And Shaphan the Sofer, the scribe, showed the Melech, saying, Hishkiyahu, the Kohen, has delivered to me a scroll. And Shaphan the scribe read the scroll before the Melech. Verse 11. And it came to pass when the Melech, of course, that's Yoshiyahu, who was 8 years old when he began to rule. And verse, we were in 10, right? 11. And it came to pass when the Melech had heard the words of the scroll of the Torah that he tore his clothes. And the Melech commanded Hilkiyahu, the Kohen, and Ahicham, the son of Shaphan, and Achvor, the son of Michaiah, and Shaphan the Sofer, and Asaiah, and Eved of the Melech, saying, the Melech said, go inquire of Yahuwah for me and for all the people of Yehuda concerning the words of this scroll that is found. For great is the wrath of Yahuwah that is lit against us, because our Ahavot have not listened to the words of this scroll to do all that is written concerning us. So when we combine these two thoughts, number one, a Kohen who was taken into the exile of the 10 tribes is sent back to Jerusalem by the king of Assyria to learn the ways of the Elohim of the land of Israel. At the very same time that he's there, Melech Yoshiyahu and the Kohen Hagadol discover, and the scribe Shaphan discover the Torah dusty in a corner, being unused, unstudied, and they bring it out to be read by the king and to the people. And it's the same time that the legitimate Kohen who was taken away with the 10 tribes is sent back to Yerushalayim, and he encounters that same event. He receives the Torah the same time that Shaphan and Hiskiyahu bring out the Torah to the people. But what's very important is to understand, and you see this later in 2 Kings 22, 16, 17, and 18, that both Judah and Ephraim were doing the same thing. Judah was not following the Torah. That's why it was in mothballs and in dust. Ephraim was not following the Torah because they had been taken away into exile because they rebelled against Yahuwah. So both, it was very important to understand is both houses were doing and were guilty of the exact same thing. And if you go back to verse 3, just as a reminder, if you think you're too young, you're too inexperienced, you're too immature, this revival of Yoshiyahu broke out when Yoshiyahu was only 18 years old.
Tenemos que comprender que simultáneamente, you need to make yourself sure.
Yoshiyahu, I don't hear you. Let me see.
He didn't hear you somehow. So just repeat.
Can you talk for a second? Don't hear you. Which last sentence was that? Okay, so what is important to understand?
Okay, lo que es importante comprender. You need to make when I talk.
One second, I understand all that, but now I can't recapture that.
Because you have your chat on.
No. What's important to understand is that when there was a revival under King Josiah, Yoshiyahu in Judah, because of the legitimate Kohen that went there to bring back the ways of Elohim to the north, so a great revival and conversion to monotheism happened in Shomron simultaneous to when it was happening in Judah.
Entonces, basado en
what we just read about, when we combine those two scriptures, the simultaneous revival was in approximately 561 to 533. Let me change that a little bit. Okay, let me change that a little bit. The Josiah revival in Judah was approximately 623. When the priest returned, revival to monotheism and away from paganism took place in Shomron for the next, let's say, 60, 70 years. What's very important to understand is, and not to forget, the Shomronim had returned to seek Yahuwah. This is very clear, and I must repeat it. I'm going to say it again. Because of the Kohen sent to the house of Judah in the days of Yoshiyahu, over the next 70 years, there was a massive teshuvah, repentance, among the 10 tribes of Shomron in the north. In approximately 536, approximately 100 years later, Judah had backslidden back into Yahuwah worship sometime and pagan worship sometime. So within 80 to 100 years, Judah had again backslidden, not to mention they had broken the Shemitah, the laws of the land Shabbat. In approximately 580 or so, 580 BC, the house of Yehuda had backslidden from the days of Melech Yoshiyahu, and Yahuwah had sent them into the Galut, into exile in the land of Bavel. In the year 536, Koresh, not David Koresh from Waco, Texas, but the real Koresh, Cyrus, issued a decree. Now, that's very important. This is not the return. This is merely the decree, the permission to end Yehuda's 70 years in Bavel. Very shortly thereafter, in about 533 BC, the Yehudim first arrived in Jerusalem and began to rebuild the altar to offer up the burnt offerings on the old foundation, and they laid a new foundation in a smaller size to rebuild Jerusalem as well as the temple. We can read in Ezra, and we're not going to turn there now. We read in Ezra 3, verses 3 through 10. Ezra chapter 3, verses 3 through 10, we read of the rebuilding project to rebuild the altar and the house of Yahuwah in Jerusalem about 3 years after Melech Koresh gave the decree to rebuild. At the end of Ezra chapter 3, rejoicing, worship, Hodule Yahuwah Kitov, the people celebrate the restoration of the altar and the beginning of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Now we come to one of the most misunderstood and important scriptures that most believers, including myself, have read 700 times. But unless you're willing to think outside the box, okay, you're going to stay blind. We don't want you to stay blind. That's why you're listening to this ministry, okay? So everyone needs to turn right now. I'm going to give you a minute to turn. I want everyone with an open scripture to Ezra chapter 4, verses 4 through 7, but we may do some other verses. I'll give you a minute to turn to Ezra chapter. This is the key, or one of the main keys to understanding this entire message about the Ezra Monopoly and the translators of the XIV. Now this is so important that I'm going to have Yoshiyahu and Mariamne read verses 1 through 4 straight through before I teach. Again, verses 1 through 4 in your own language that you're translating straight through. Now, before I read and explain this in English, I want to reaffirm what I said earlier. It's on your screen. Let's use just the NIV to show you an example. Then we're going back. This is where we began the message. We're going to go back to 2 Kings 17:27. That guy that I told you was sent to Judah. He's the one who brought back the Paleo Torah to the Shomronim. Okay, he's the one who brought back the Paleo Torah to the Shomronim. It says the king of Assyria gave the order: have one of the priests that you took captive, who is now in Samaria, listen, let him go back to live in Samaria. Listen, he's going to go to the Josiah revival. He's going to go back to live in Samaria and teach the Torah to the people, which the Elohim of the land requires. And the same thing is said in the New Living Translation. The king of Assyria said, send the exiled priest back to Samaria to live there and teach the Torah, which he found while he was visiting in Jerusalem. So that was the Paleo Hebrew Torah that remained with the Shomronim until this day. And we know that as the Shomronite Torah. That's what we know today as the Shomronite Torah, even though the original dated back from the days of Joshua.
Okay, aquí está Julia explicando. Please speak yourself, Julia.
The point is, because of this Kohen who returned to Shomron, the great revival began and continued for 60, 70 years. The Jews were taken to Babylon, and then these repentant Shomronim, guardians of the covenant, came to Ezra and said, "We want to help." Now it's my turn to read in English. Now, before I do that, no translation. Before I do that, who wrote Ezra? ¿Quién escribió Ezra? Ezra wrote Ezra, obviously. So watch the way he classifies these returning Shomronites. Go ahead.
A los guardianes de
Ezra's
los samaritanos.
Ezra's attitude is exactly the same as the prodigal of the parable son, the older brother who sees his brother Ephraim returning from playing with the pigs and has a terrible attitude and doesn't want his brother home and sees his brother as an enemy rather than a family member. Who wrote Ezra? Ezra wrote Ezra. You're going to see his attitude. Worse than that, that same attitude that we're going to read in his own writing found its way to the entire XIV, and every Bible and every translation that we have today comes directly from the compilation of the translator. Somebody said, oh, it doesn't say they were translators. Somebody said they were just reading the Torah because the people couldn't speak Hebrew. Don't be a fool, okay? Ezra didn't translate the whole Tanakh by himself. That was a team of translators, just like the Septuagint had a team of 70, okay? So I had someone online make a comment, and his comment was, well, the XIV, the 14, they were proclaimers of the Torah. It doesn't say they were translators. Don't be a fool, okay? No man can translate the whole Torah by himself. This was a team of translators who then proclaimed what they had translated. I'm reading verse 1, Ezra chapter 4, no interruptions. Now, when the adversaries of Yehuda and Benjamin, notice Ezra refers to his returning Shomronite brothers as enemies, even though they had made teshuvah from the days of Josiah until the Babylonian captivity. They had made teshuvah. They had repented. They had begun to serve Elohim. You could even make a case that they were more repentant than Judah. Now, when the adversaries of Yehuda and Benjamin heard that the 10 tribes of the children of the exile had rebuilt the Hekel to Yahuwah Elohim of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the Ahavot and said to them, we, the 10 tribes, want to rebuild with you. We are your family. We are your family. We have made teshuvah. We want to rebuild with you because watch this. Listen, we seek Yahuwah, your Elohim, just like you. We sing, we worship, we sacrifice to Yahuwah Elohim just like you. There is no difference between Jews and Joes. We both serve the same Yahuwah Elohim. Since the days of the Melech of Assyria, who sent one of the Kohanim to learn, we are one of you. We are here not to build a separate temple on Mount Gerazim. No, we are here to build the house of Yahuwah in Yerushalayim. Will you accept us? Will you receive us? But Zerubbabel, Yehusha, and the other elders, the Ahavots of Israel, said, heck no. You're a bunch of half-breed pagans. You mix with the Assyrians. You worship strange Elohim. What they didn't recognize was that they were the ones who were continuing to worship false Elohim, while the house of Israel had made teshuvah and had returned to one Elohim. And Ezra, you're going to see this in a second. Hold on. Ezra, because of his attitude and rejection, sent Ephraim back into paganism. You're not listening. It was because of Ezra's attitude that the Shomronim returned to paganism when they were discouraged. They presented themselves to serve Yahuwah, and Ezra and Yeshua and Zerubbabel, all those hallowed names that we honor and that we respect, told their Ephraimite brothers, go to hell. You have nothing to do with us in this matter. Well, offended and rejected. What does an offended and rejected person or people do? They go out and do their own thing, separate from the family that has rejected them. Look at the end of verse 3. Ezra, Zerubbabel, Yehusha, all the Ahavot said, not only will we not let you rebuild, we will rebuild the temple and the altar ourselves. We don't need you. Go to hell. And literally destine them to hell. And I'm not using that as a figure of speech. We will rebuild ourselves because the Melech, verse 3, I'm in Ezra 4:3. If you're just joining us, we have a commandment from Koresh, Ciro, the Melech of Persia, and we don't need you. And verse 4, the people of the land, that's Ephraim, the Shomronim, the guardians of the covenant, began to oppose the building of the temple and began to trouble them because they were rejected. And like any rejected family or person, they go and do their own thing and isolate themselves. So they began to trouble the Jews. They hired counselors to frustrate them. They began to ridicule them. They began to distract them.
I don't think they heard me. Hold on. I think I did say that. Lo voy a repetir.
So when they were frustrated, they hired people, they distracted the workers. They said, okay, well, we made teshuvah. You guys didn't make teshuvah because you got brachat out when Koresh let you return. We already made teshuvah. We're here to help. Ezra, even though he was a good man, but he had a terrible attitude toward the other house of Israel, told them to go to hell. So to hell they went. And they began to oppose the building of Yahuwah's house in Jerusalem. And whose fault was that? Whose fault was that? They were so offended that Ezra and the XIV, the 14 leaders, translators, would not let them build the house of Yahuwah. Not only did they hire opponents and oppose the work, they wrote a letter to Achashverosh, Melech of Persia, demanding that the work stop because the Achashverosh of Persia had replaced Koresh, okay, Cyrus. And so there was a new king, and now the Babylonians had been conquered by the Persians, and they wrote a letter to the Persian king to even get the Persians to reverse the command of Koresh. I'll say that again. They were so offended that they wrote letters to the new Melech of Persia, who conquered the Babylonians, that the work should stop because the Jews were scoundrels. Whose fault was that? Whose fault was that? See, there are two sides to every coin. You guys have only heard one side of the story. I'm showing you the other side of the story. And the leaders of the Shomronim wrote a letter to Melech Achashverosh. That's the same Melech in the book of Esther, listing all the accusations and the reasons why he must order the cessation of the rebuilding of the house of Yahuwah. Now, in verse 7, we see the letter was written in Aramaic, which again shows you what the language was from which they were translating into Hebrew. So they wrote to the king in verse 7 of Ezra chapter 4 in Aramaic, and it lists a whole bunch of stuff. And if you look in verse 13 on some of the accusations, be it known to the Melech, I'm in verse 13, if you allow the city and the temple to be rebuilt, they will not pay fees. They will not pay taxes. They're a bunch of cheating Jews. They're a bunch of cheap Jews. They will not pay taxes. They will not give reverence to your kingdom. They will cause the treasury to collapse, and the economy of the Persian Empire will be in recession and depression. Don't trust these Jewish people. They're cheap. They're liars. They're deceivers. And they wouldn't let us back into the family. And we're writing to you that if you don't stop them from doing what they want to do, your economy will collapse. Because they were offended. If Ezra had just obeyed the scriptures and known the will and heart of Yahuwah, he would not have had that attitude. And that is the same attitude that caused him to change the word of Yahuwah. I'm going to say that again. That is the same attitude that caused him, and it gave him the authority, he thought, to make changes, 21 changes. I found 21 changes in the word of Yahuwah. If a man is willing to stop the two-house reunion of Ezekiel 37, what else is he willing to do? He was a good man. Without Ezra, we would not have the Tanakh. But I'm showing you he was an anti-Semite, because Ephraimites are also Semites. Ephraimites are not sons of Ham.
Ezra.
If you look at the end of the chapter 4, they had written a letter in Aramaic with a whole bunch of accusations. Now I'm going to read verse 22 to 24, and then I want you guys to read it as well fast.
Yeah.
We are in Ezra chapter 4. So we can't claim that someone's lying about Ezra or someone is accusing Ezra, because last time I checked, we're reading the book of Ezra, which was written by who? By Ezra. So no one can say, okay, you're doing Lashon Hara against Ezra, because we're reading Ezra's own words that he wrote. So he says in verse 22, King, beware of these Jews. You can't trust them. Look, why would you damage the herd of your Malchut? And when the copy of Melech Achashverosh's letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the Sofer, and their companions, meaning other Persians, they went in a hurry to Jerusalem, to the Yehudim, and forced the Yehudim by force and power to cease the building of the temple and the walls. Then, verse 24, the work of Yahuwah and the Bayit of Elohim in Jerusalem ceased from the days of Achashverosh until the second year of Dariavash, Melech of Persia. So the Ephraimites who wanted to build the house of Yahuwah and not build a separate temple on Mount Gerazim were rejected, and in their anger and vindictiveness achieved the king of the Persians to cause the work to cease. So in Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, the Nevi'im, Haggai, and Zechariah, speaking through the Ruach HaKadosh, commanded Jewish Israel to resume the building, because even though Ezra had and the leaders had done wrong against the Shomronim, Yahuwah's purpose had to continue and would stand. So in Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, the Ruach of Yahuwah commands the people through Haggai and Zechariah that the work must continue. The king until the second year of Darius. In 520, you'll see on your screen. So the building ceased for approximately 11 years. That was in 520. And then the temple is completed in approximately 516 BC. We go to Ezra chapter 6. In verses 13 through 18. We see that the temple is completed. We see that the temple was completed. Koresh commanded it to be rebuilt. Dariash reversed the command, and then another king, Artaxerxes, allowed it. So it was back. It was basically back and forth for 11 years until the temple was completed. So understand this. The temple was finished in about 516, but the city had not yet been finished. By 465 BC, look on your screen, the Shomronim and the Yehudim had become intense enemies because of the pitiful attitude of the leaders of Yehuda. So once the temple and then the city of Jerusalem is rebuilt, Ezra has the time to gather the 14 translators and leaders to begin work on what we have today, which I have called and other scholars have called the XIV, which stands for the Roman numeral XIV, the 14 who helped Ezra translate from the Paleo Hebrew into Aramaic block letters. It was still Hebrew, but the Hebrew had ceased to be Paleo. And we now had the first Torah with Aramaic block letters, which today is referred to as modern Hebrew. I missed that. I was muted. Remember the guy who went in the revival to Judah and brought back in the days of King Josiah the Torah in Aramaic. That's how the Shomronim got the Paleo Hebrew Torah. But Ezra translated it into Aramaic block letters, and that's how we got the Masoretic and all the translations today in Aramaic block letters. But the Shomronites have the Torah in Paleo. How? Remember, we began in 2 Kings 22 when the Kohen returned to Shomron with a copy of the Paleo Torah, one of the copies that King Josiah found in the house of Yahuwah. So that's how the Shomronim have the Paleo Torah, and the Yehudim do not have the Paleo Torah.
Y lo tienen en el
In Ezra 7:12, we read the following. And Artahashta Melech of Melachim to Ezra the Kohen, a sofer of the Torah of the Elohim, of the Shamayim, perfect shalom to you at such a time. So if we look at Ezra 7:11 and 12, the opinion of everybody, including the foreign kings, is that Ezra is the only qualified person who has perfect understanding of the Torah, being both a Paleo-Hebrew scholar as well as a Zadokite priest. It was common consensus that Ezra was the only one qualified to translate the Torah, to teach the people with his team, seeing that he was a scholar and also a Zadokite priest. The only problem with the consensus was the consensus did not take into account the fact that he rejected his brother in order to have a monopoly on the rebuilding of the temple, as well as on the explaining the Torah to those who had been paganized in Babylon. So the consensus was he's the man, but that consensus did not take into account the lengths which he was willing to go to keep Ephraim from serving Yahuwah. But because of his unchallenged authority, he was accountable to nobody except himself and his team of 14 teachers slash translators. He took the freedom and he took that attitude that stopped Ephraim from building, and he made 21 very subtle. I got to tell you, we're going to cover this in, willing, in the future. These changes are so subtle that unless you're a scholar, you will not see them or recognize them. These were changes that were made to counter the Shomronite arguments regarding Mount Gerazim. I'll say that again. These were subtle changes to counter Shomronite arguments against Mount Gerazim. So you will come to understand that both Mount Gerazim and Mount Moriah are both legitimate places of worship for different reasons. I'm going to say that again. As we go through this study in upcoming weeks, you will come to understand that it's not either or, it's both. Both Moriah and Gerazim are legitimate places of worship. That's why this issue was never settled. Ezra was the resident expert on the Torah as he introduced his brand new Aramaic Hebrew lettered Bible manuscripts. I didn't think it was that funny. Go ahead. By 445 BC, these are the things that are completed: the city, the temple, and Ezra's brand new XIV. And I'm going to say it again. Every Bible in the world, I don't care what language, I don't care what version, comes from the Ezra XIV. The only exception are a few of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Shomronite Torah. So that begs the question, do we have in our hand the word of Yahuwah, or is it corrupted by Ezra? But if you're asking yourself that question, that means you're not paying attention. Without Ezra, we would have no Bible, because the Shomronite Torah only is the 5 books. So we're not throwing shade on Ezra. I'm trying to show you that the problem we have with the Samaritans, with the temple on Mount Gerazim, is Ezra's fault. Because if Ezra had allowed them to build Yahuwah's house, they wouldn't have built the temple. Let me say this again. Before Ezra rejected Ephraim, there was no temple on Mount Gerazim. And we'll talk about that in the future. Let me say that again. Before Ezra rejected the house of Ephraim, there was no temple on Mount Gerazim.
No. Ephraim.
In 333 BC, the several historians record that not only were the Shomronim not welcome in Judah, but that they had, just like their ancestors 400 years earlier, they had been another mass deportation to Alexandria, Egypt. Now, this is very important to understand. When the Jewish leaders who had the XIV, they were presented with an issue that there were large amounts of Israelites living in Alexandria, Egypt. And the reason was because of what we see. The Shomronim, who were rejected in Judah, were later deported to Egypt. So the rabbis said the community of Israelites in Alexandria, Egypt, was so great that they commissioned the Septuagint. Hold on. They commissioned the Septuagint based on what manuscript? Their own, the XIV. Now, you see, many of you are like me over the years. Oh, I use the Septuagint. Why? Because the Septuagint was used by Yehusha, correct? And the Septuagint was used by the Shliachim, correct? So I'm like you. For many years, I thought, well, I don't use the Masoretic. I use the Septuagint. Guess what? I found out that the Septuagint, just like the Masoretic, is based on Ezra's XIV. Now, Yahusha knew of the 21 changes that Ezra had made because he is Yahuwah. So when he opened the door to another Shomronite revival, just like the ones between Josiah and Ezra, there was a big revival in Shomron between the days of Josiah and Ezra, before Ezra. But Yahusha brought another revival based on the Besorah, because Yahusha went because he had to reverse the 21 changes that Ezra made. If they had lived with the 21 changes that Ezra made, those errors would remain and the Shomronites would not be evangelized. Yahusha knew that the attitude of Ezra against the people of Israel, a part of the people of Israel, was wrong. And that's why he himself went all the way to Shomron to welcome Ephraim back, reversing the serious errors of the priest Ezra. I want to make a couple of quick points, and one of those points is very worth re-emphasis. The irony of the Ezra XIV being translated into Greek in the Septuagint, here's the irony, was primarily Ezra's, let's say that again, Ezra's work was translated by 70 scribes in what became known as Septuagint, ironically, for the Shomronite population that had been deported in 333. If that doesn't get you, nothing will. Think about the irony. I'm going to say that again. Okay, the Shomronim were the people whom Ezra rejected, right? Ezra's descendants, the Pharisees, commissioned that Ezra's translation be translated into Greek for the Samaritans. The Samaritans hated Ezra. The Shomronim hated Ezra. And yet it was Ezra's manuscript that led to the Greek Septuagint for the Shomronim who hated Ezra. So actually, the first time that the Shomronim read the Tanakh, a lot of the Shomronim had never read the Tanakh because the Shomronim only accept the Torah until the Septuagint arrived, which was based on Ezra. On Ezra's because Ezra's compilation was translated by the rabbis into Greek, the Shomronim read the Tanakh for the first time because the Shomronim only held to the inerrancy of the Torah. Are you getting this? How ironic this is? Wouldn't it have been easier for Ezra to have heard from the Ruach and allowed those people to be part of Israel? But because they hated Ezra, they didn't read the Tanakh. One of the reasons the Shomronim reject the Tanakh is because of Ezra. Did you ever wonder why they only believe in the Torah? They don't like Ezra. And yet, through the Septuagint, Ezra was introduced to the Shomronim in Egypt. Before we close, it's very important that I repeat this, that listen very, very, as carefully as you can, there was no temple that the allegedly, Shomronim built until Ezra told them to get lost. Because people think, oh, these pagans, they built a temple and they didn't submit to the Torah. Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. There was no temple on Mount Gerazim until 100 years after Ezra rejected them. And they still were not welcome, so they built their own temple because they still were not welcome. Now watch this. This is a Torah war. I want you to look at your screen. In direct response to Ezra's attitude and rejection of the guardians of the covenant, the word Samaritans is not in the Bible. It's only in religion because we believed a lot of the lies about them. The Shomronim, in response to Ezra's 21 changes and his attitude, made 3 changes. Now, this is what the research says. I am not 100% convinced of this. As I've studied some more, and Mariamne and I have discussed this the other day, the 10 Commandments, the Samaritans made 3 changes. 2 of them, I believe, were in the 10 Commandments, but we're no longer 100% sure that these were changes. That requires more understanding. Okay, and I don't want to get into that now because we have to wind down. But in response to Ezra, it appears, let me use that word, appears. It appears in the Shomronite Torah to counter Ezra, they made 3 changes. It appears, and again, I am reviewing this. This is still under investigation. The Shomronite temple only existed for 222 years. The Samaritan temple that they built because they were rejected in Jerusalem was destroyed 222 years later in 111 BC on your screen. This is recorded by Josephus Flavius. Hyrcanus was actually a descendant of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmonean family of Judah, Simon, and Jonathan, and Mattathias, the Maccabees. So John Hyrcanus was actually a descendant of the Hashmonaim, but they had already become apostatized. But it was the Maccabees who actually destroyed the Samaritan temple. Quite ironic. They preserved the temple in Jerusalem, but they turned around and destroyed the Shomronite temple, all because they were not welcome in the Jerusalem temple, which they had purified. A lot of weird turn of events. A few more things. Now, before we get to the time of Yahusha, that'll be, willing, a few months from now, we have to also understand that in the Jewish wars against Rome, the Romans didn't care if they were Shomronim or Yehudim. They just wanted the Israelite headache to go away. So not only they waged war against the Yehudim, but the Romans also destroyed, the Romans also killed, as you see on your screen, 11,000 Shomronim. So remember, there was a deportation, okay, in about 100 and, where was that? Anyway, it was back before they were deported, and then the Romans came and began to kill, according to Josephus, almost 12,000 Shomronim.
No solamente vemos
So at the time of Yahusha, from what I have studied, there were 1 million Shomronim. By the time The Romans killed them. We see that on the screen. Then later in about 400 AD, the Byzantines killed more of the Shomronite. After the Byzantine Christians, in 600, the Muslims eliminated the residents of Shomron, so that today there's less than 1,000. And they've grown in recent years, but today there's about 800. They are growing, interestingly enough, with Ukrainian women. They're allowing Ukrainian women to marry their men because there are not enough women to increase the community. So let me re-summarize again. They went from 1 million Shomronim at the time of Yehusha. This is despite the deportations. Then after the Romans killed them, the Byzantines killed them in 400 AD when they came into the Holy Land in the Crusades. And then the Muslims killed them starting in 600. It left about 400 or 500. Today, there are only 800 Shomronim left in the world. Those Shomronim have never left the land of Israel and their ancestors. Think about that. Only 800 left. The enemy hates them because he wants to wipe out the other house of Israel, even if whether it's by attitude or by war. He doesn't care. Just quickly, you know what I'm thinking? And this is a terrible thing, but there are more Ukrainian refugees, women who are going to lose their husband in war. They're wandering in Poland and Romania. It's possible that some of these Ukrainian refugees are going to wind up living on Mount Gerazim. Is this crazy or what?
Craig.
I mean, we don't really know what Yahuwah is doing completely. We have an idea, but I mean, his ways are deep, because those women in the community that we saw on the video, they are being accepted by the Kohanim of the Shomronim. And how ironic, there are more women now that are going to need husbands. I'm like, wow, this is cray-cray, man. This is cray-cray. Don't get any ideas, Rivka. You stay right here. Don't you move. Don't you get any ideas. My friends, we are going to have to continue this next week and the week after. This is such an eye-opener and gives us a balanced perspective. So we're going to continue this. Yah be with us and Yah willing in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, Rebbetzin, come on up, please. Mariamne.
Mientras tanto, Rabina Rivka, Mariamne, vengan hacia adelante.
We thank you all for being with us and being patient. And we pray that this new format will work itself out and that we've been a blessing on this Kadosh Yom, because it's our desire to always be a blessing, because it is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is Shabbat. It is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is Shabbat. Praise Yahuwah. It is
Shabbat Shalom Israel.
Shabbat Shalom.
Sayonara. Next language, Japanese.
One love, one heart. Let's get together and feel Shabbat. Shema Yisrael, one love. Shema Yisrael, one heart.
Israel, one love. Shema Israel, one heart. Give thanks and praise to Yahweh, and we will feel Shabbat. Let's get together and feel Shabbat. Give thanks and praise to Yahweh, and we will feel Shabbat. Let's get together and feel Are you going to Har Zion? Worship Yah at the appointed time. Seek the one who once been there. Then you'll be a brother of mine. Are you going to Har Zion? Wearing kippah and tzitzit, worship Yah at the appointed time. Seek the one who lives inside you. Then you'll be a brother of mine. Are you going to Har Zion? Worship Yah at the appointed time. Seek the one who once been there. Then you'll be a brother of mine. Are you going to Har Zion? Wearing kippah and tzitzit, worship Yah at the appointed time. Seek the one who lives inside you.